The year is 1600. London is a city of mud, fog, and ambition. The River Thames smells of tar and rotting wood. Yet on its banks, a group of merchants gathers in a dimly lit hall. They are not generals. They are not kings. They are men of ledgers and ink, counting coins by candlelight. They possess a piece of parchment signed by Queen Elizabeth I, a charter granting them a monopoly on trade with the East. At this moment, they are nothing more than a startup, desperate for spices. They have no idea that the ink on that paper is the first drop of blood in a flood that will drown a civilization. Cut to 2 centuries later. The scene shifts from the cold fog of London to the blinding heat of Bengal. A young Indian weaver sits by his loom, his hands trembling. The silence of the village is broken not by the call to prayer, but by the rhythmic thud of boots. Soldiers in red coats, private mercenaries paid by a private board of directors, march through the dust. They are not here to trade, they are here to collect. The weaver looks at his starving children, then at the soldiers who serve a master they have never seen, a corporation thousands of miles away. This was not an invasion by a country, it was a hostile takeover by a company. The world has seen empires rise and fall. It has seen conquerors like Alexander and Genghis Khan. But history had never seen this, a group of shareholders conquering a subcontinent, not with a sword, but with a signature. To understand how a business became a brutal empire and how the modern corporate world was born in blood and gunpowder, join us on this journey into the dark heart of commerce. Subscribe now and witness the rise of the world's most dangerous company. The Merchant's Gamble, from spices to sovereignty. To understand the monster, one must first look at the egg. The East India Company did not begin with cannons, fortresses, and ambition to rule the world. It began with a dinner table. In the late 16th century, the tables of Europe's aristocracy were bland, tasteless landscapes. The meat was often salted and rotting, barely palatable without the masking agent of spice. Pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon were not merely flavorings, they were the preservatives of life, the status symbols of kings, and the most valuable commodities on earth. A sack of nutmeg was worth more than its weight in gold. To control the spice was to control the currency of the world. But for the English, there was a problem. The Dutch controlled the spice, and they were squeezing London dry. In 1599, the price of pepper on the London market spiked by 300%. It was a crisis of commerce that sparked a revolution of history. On a damp, gray afternoon in September, a motley collection of merchants, adventurers, and privateers gathered in a dilapidated building in Moorgate Fields. These were not the polished aristocrats of the royal court. They were men of rough hands and sharp eyes, men who understood risk. They pooled their money, a sum of roughly £30,000, to petition Queen Elizabeth I for a royal charter. They proposed a radical idea, a joint stock company. It was a mechanism that allowed them to share the colossal risk of sending ships into the unknown void of the oceans. If the ship sank, they all lost a little. If it returned, they all gained a fortune. On December 31st, 1600, as the century turned, the Queen signed the charter. The Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies was born. It was a clumsy name for a dangerous enterprise. They were granted a monopoly on English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. They had the legal right to wage war, sign treaties, and govern territory, provided it served the profit of the shareholders. But as their first fleet of 4 small, creaking ships left the harbor of Woolwich, weighed down with lead, tin, and broadcloth to trade, they looked less like conquerors and more like a suicide mission.
They were sailing into a world they did not understand, to trade with empires that did not need them. The journey itself was a graveyard. For months, the sailors lived in a wooden purgatory, battling scurvy that turned their gums to black pulp, and storms that threatened to snap their masts like dry twigs. When they finally rounded the Cape and drifted into the warm, scented waters of the Indian Ocean, they were not entering a primitive void. They were entering the economic engine of the world. At this time, the Mughal Empire under Emperor Akbar and later his son Jahangir controlled nearly a quarter of the world's manufacturing output. India was the workshop of the world, producing the finest cottons, the most intricate silks, and the sharpest steel.
Contrast this with the Englishmen who waded ashore at the port of Surat in 1608. They were bedraggled, smelling of unwashed wool and desperation. They brought with them heavy English broadcloth, a fabric entirely useless in the tropical heat of India. The Mughal officials looked at these red-faced foreigners with a mix of amusement and pity. The English had nothing the Indians wanted. Europe was a backwater. India was the destination. The early company agents were not demanding territory, they were begging for permission. They stood for hours in the humid courtyards of local governors, swatting away flies, bribing officials with wine and trinkets, hoping for a firman, a royal decree allowing them to set up a simple warehouse or factory. Sir Thomas Roe, the first English ambassador sent to the Mughal court by King James I, described the humiliation vividly. He arrived expecting to impress the Oriental despots with the power of England. Instead, he found himself ignored at the back of a court dripping in jewels, where the emperor sat on the peacock throne, flanked by elephants and armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Roe wrote home that the Mughals were rich beyond the dreams of avarice. He realized quickly that force was impossible. The company could not fight this giant. They had to seduce it. They had to become useful. And so the company adopted the guise of the humble servant. They set up their trading posts along the coast, Madras, Bombay, Calcutta. They fortified them, ostensibly to protect their goods from pirates and rival European powers like the French and Dutch. But these factories were the seeds of something darker. Within the walls of the warehouses, the company created its own microcosm. They had their own laws, their own currency, and eventually their own guards. They were a state within a state, growing quietly like a parasitic vine on the trunk of the great mobile banyan tree. They waited. They watched. They realized that while the Mughal Empire was strong, it was not monolithic. It was a tapestry of rival princes, ambitious generals, and corrupt officials. And everything, even loyalty, had a price. The ledgers in London began to fill. The ships returned not with useless tin, but with calico textiles that became the rage of London fashion, and saltpeter, the key ingredient for gunpowder. Dividends soared. The shareholders in London, sipping their tea in comfortable drawing rooms, did not care how the profits were made, only that they arrived. But back in India, the demeanor of the humble merchant was beginning to crack. The facade of servitude was slipping, revealing the cold steel of ambition underneath. The gamble was paying off. But a gamble is only successful if you know when to walk away, or if you decide to take over the entire casino. The tipping point arrived not with a bang, but with the final rattling breath. In 1707, Emperor Aurangzeb, the last of the great Mughals, died. He left behind an empire that was geographically vast, but fiscally hollowed out by endless wars in the Deccan. With his death, the gravitational center of the subcontinent collapsed. The throne in Delhi became a musical chair for weak, ephemeral rulers who were often blinded or murdered by their own courtiers. The iron grip of central authority rusted overnight, and the peripheries began to drift away.
Powerful regional governors, the Nizams of Hyderabad, the Nawabs of Bengal and Oudh, stopped sending taxes to Delhi and started carving out independent kingdoms. For the East India Company, this chaos was terrifying. Trade hates uncertainty. A caravan carrying silk from Bengal to Surat could now be raided by Maratha horsemen, taxed by 3 different warlords, and finally looted by bandits before it ever reached the coast. But in every crisis, the merchant sees an opportunity. The directors in London realized that if the Mughal state could no longer protect their profits, the company would have to protect them itself. The factory, once just a warehouse for goods, began to mutate. The wooden palisades were replaced by stone walls, bastions were raised, cannons were hauled up from the ships and pointed not just out at the sea, but inward toward the land. In Madras, Fort St. George rose from the sand like a challenge. In Calcutta, Fort William became a sovereign island where British law, not Mughal law, reigned supreme. The humble traders were putting on armor. But the English were not the only predators circling the dying empire. The French East India Company, led by the ambitious and brilliant Joseph-François Dupleix, had arrived late to the party but was playing a more dangerous game. Dupleix realized a fundamental truth that had escaped the English. India was not just a market, it was a reservoir of manpower. He began to recruit local Indian soldiers, train them in European discipline, arm them with flintlock muskets, and rent this private army out to warring Indian princes. The English watched with jealousy and alarm. They saw the French gaining influence, territories, and vast sums of money by playing kingmaker. The board of directors in London, initially hesitant to spend money on war, did the calculus. If they did not militarize, they would be pushed into the sea by the French. And so the merchants' gamble shifted stakes. It was no longer about who could sell the cheapest pepper, it was about who could field the most disciplined battalion. This was the birth of the Sepoy.
The company began to hire its own local troops. These were men from the warrior castes of the Gangetic Plains, tall, proud, and martial. They donned the red coats of the company, not out of loyalty to a king in England they had never seen, but for the steady silver rupee and the honor of the regiment. It was a devil's bargain that would define the next 2 centuries. India was being conquered by Indian hands, paid for by Indian revenue, for British profit. By the 1740s, the Carnatic coast in the south had turned into a chessboard. The English backed one claimant for a local throne, the French backed another. These were not national wars declared by governments, they were corporate wars declared by local governors. Imagine Google and Apple hiring private armies to shell each other's headquarters while the government looked on helplessly. That was the reality of 18th century India. Through the smoke of these early skirmishes, a new breed of company man began to emerge. These were not the cautious scribes of the 1600s. These were aggressive, hungry young men who came to India to make their fortune and return to England as nabobs, wealthy aristocrats. They saw the weakness of the Indian states not as a tragedy, but as a harvest. And among the ships arriving in Madras in 1744, carrying supplies and clerks, was a troubled, violent, and utterly fearless young man named Robert Clive. He had no military training. He was a writer, a board clerk who had once tried to blow his own brains out with a pistol that failed to fire twice. Fate, it seemed, had saved him for a darker purpose. He looked at the chaos of the crumbling empire and didn't see danger. He saw a ladder. If the crumbling Mughal Empire was a dying giant, the province of Bengal was its beating heart. In the mid-18th century, Bengal was not merely a region, it was an economic phenomenon. It was described by travelers as the paradise of nations. Its soil, fed by the great wandering rivers of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, was so fertile it yielded 3 harvests a year.
Its weavers produced muslins so fine it was known poetically as woven wind, textiles that were coveted in the markets of Cairo, Istanbul, and Paris. Bengal alone accounted for 60% of British trade in Asia. It was the engine room of the global economy. For the East India Company, Bengal was the ultimate prize. But in 1756, a new shadow fell over their ledger. The old, pliable Nawab died and was succeeded by his grandson, Sir Iraj-ud-Daulah. He was 23 years old, impetuous, suspicious, and fiercely proud. Unlike his predecessors, Siraj did not see the British as harmless traitors. He saw them for what they were becoming, a tumor growing on the side of his sovereign state. He watched as they strengthened the walls of Fort William in Calcutta without his permission. He watched as they abused their trade privileges, cheating his treasury of tax revenue. He saw the state within a state they were building, and he decided to crush it before it became unstoppable. He sent a simple ultimatum to the British governor: demolish your fortifications, or I will come and pull them down myself. The British, blinded by their own arrogance, ignored him. They believed a native prince would never dare strike the company. It was a fatal miscalculation. In June 1756, Siraj-ud-Daulah marched on Calcutta with 30,000 soldiers, war elephants, and heavy artillery. The British garrison, manned by merchants and a handful of soldiers, crumbled within days. The governor and the senior officials did something unforgivable. They fled to the ships in the harbor, leaving the women, children, and junior officers behind to face the wrath of the Nawab. Calcutta fell. The company's flag was torn down. The loss of assets was catastrophic. But what happened next gave the company something more valuable than money. It gave them a cause. On the night of the surrender, dozens of British prisoners were allegedly herded into a small, airless dungeon in the fort, a room measuring only 14 by 18 feet. It was the height of the Indian summer. The heat was suffocating. By morning, according to the survivor John Zephaniah Halwell, only 23 of the 146 prisoners walked out alive. The rest had died of heat stroke and suffocation. This incident became known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. While historians bedeep the numbers, some argue they were exaggerated by Halwell to whip up hysteria. The effect was electric. In London and Madras, the narrative shifted instantly. The company was no longer an aggressor, illegally fortifying a foreign city. It was a victim of Oriental barbarism. Revenge was not just demanded, it was required to restore the honor of the English nation. But beneath the talk of honor, the directors knew the real truth. If they lost Bengal, they lost the dividends. The cash cow had been stolen. They needed it back. News of the fall of Calcutta reached the company's stronghold in Madras in August. The council was in panic. They needed a man who could lead a retribution force. They needed a soldier who understood the native mind, a man who was as ruthless as he was lucky. They chose the failed clerk. They chose Robert Clive. In October 1756, a fleet of warships carrying 900 Europeans and 1,500 sepoys set sail for the Bay of Bengal. Standing on the deck, watching the coast of Madras fade, Clive wrote to his father, "I am going on a service of great importance." It was an understatement. He was not going to retake a factory. He was sailing north to dismantle an empire. The merchant's gamble was over. The ledgers were closed. The time of accounting had passed. The time of the sword had arrived. The ships cut through the dark water, carrying the storm that would break India.
The corporate coup, betrayal at Plassey. When Robert Clive stepped off the ship in the ruins of Calcutta in early 1757, he did not look like a man about to conquer a subcontinent. He looked like a man settling a score. Within weeks, utilizing the superior naval power of the British fleet, he bombarded the Nawab's forces and retook the city. But Clive was a pragmatist, not a dreamer. He looked at the map and realized a terrifying truth. He had won a battle, but he could not win the war. Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal, commanded an army of 50,000 men. He had heavy artillery, French advisors, and war elephants that could trample the company's thin lines of infantry into the mud. Clive had barely 3,000 troops, a mix of British regulars and Indian sepoys. In a straight fight, the mathematics of war were clear. The company would be annihilated. But wars are not always fought on the battlefield. Sometimes they are fought in the shadows, in the quiet corners of bankers' tents, and in the whispers of dissatisfied generals. Clive realized that the Mughal armor had a crack. Siraj-ud-Dowlah was young, arrogant, and had alienated the most powerful men in his own court. Enter the Jagat-Seths. The name Jagat-Seth literally translates to banker of the world. This was not hyperbole. They were a family of Marwari bankers who controlled the economy of Bengal. Their wealth was legendary, estimated to be greater than the Bank of England at the time. They were the ones who lent money to the Nawabs, financed the trade, and held the keys to the treasury. And they hated Siraj-ud-Dowlah. The young Nawab had insulted them, slapped their patriarch in public, and threatened their wealth. For the Jagat-Seths, the British were not invaders. They were an insurance policy. They saw in the East India Company a tool to remove a volatile ruler and install a pliable puppet. A transaction was proposed. The bankers would provide the funding. The company would provide the muscle. But they needed a face for the treason. They found it in Mir Jafar. Mir Jafar was the commander-in-chief of the Nawab's army. He was an older man, bitter at being passed over for promotion, nursing a deep jealousy of the young Nawab. The deal was struck in the dark of night. If Mir Jafar would stand down his troops during the battle, if he would betray his master, Clive would make him the Nawab of Bengal. It was a corporate merger of the most lethal kind. The British provided the military brand. The Indian conspirators provided the capital and the internal sabotage. However, there was a loose end. A wealthy merchant named Amchand, who had acted as the middleman for the conspiracy, demanded a massive cut, £300,000, roughly £30 million today, to keep his mouth shut. If he wasn't paid, he would reveal the plot to Siraj-ud-Dowlah, and Clive would be executed. Clive's response to this blackmail defined the future soul of the British Empire. He didn't negotiate. He didn't pay. He cheated. Clive drew up two treaties. The White Treaty, on genuine paper, promised Mir Jafar the throne, but mentioned nothing of Amchand. The Red Treaty, a fake document on red paper, promised Amchand his money. Clive forged the signature of Admiral Watson, his naval colleague who refused to sign the lie. It was a moment of cold-blooded sociopathy. Clive looked a man in the eye, shook his hand, and handed him a contract he knew was worthless. The honor of the British gentleman died in that tent. The company was no longer operating by the rules of war or diplomacy. It was operating by the rules of a criminal syndicate. With the ink dry on the fake treaties and the real betrayal, Clive gave the order to march. It was June 1757. The monsoon clouds were gathering over the mango groves of a small village called Plassey, anglicized by history into Plassey. The stage was set for the most profitable betrayal in human history. On the morning of June 23, 1757, the sun rose over the mango groves of Plassey, burning off the mist to reveal a sight that would have terrified any rational commander. Robert Clive stood on the roof of a hunting lodge, looking out through his telescope. What he saw was a wall of steel and beast. Siraj-ud-Dowlah's army was deployed in a massive crescent formation, designed to encircle and crush the tiny British force. 50,000 infantrymen, 18,000 cavalry, 53 heavy-caliber cannons manned by French artillery experts who hated the English as much as Clive did.
and behind them, the war elephants, swaying like gray mountains, their tusks tipped with iron spikes. Clive had just 3,000 men. It was not a battle line, it was a suicide note. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of wet earth. For the first few hours, the battle was a duel of artillery. The French guns roared, sending iron balls smashing through the trees, splintering the mango trunks and sending showers of wood and leaves onto the crouching sepoys. The British returned fire, but they were hopelessly outgunned. Clive knew that if the Nawab's cavalry charged, his lines would break like dry reeds. He was waiting for a signal, a movement, a flag, anything, from the massive division on the Nawab's left flank, commanded by Mir Jafar. But Mir Jafar did not move. His division stood like statues in the heat, thousands of men, armed and ready, simply watching. It was the chilling sight on the battlefield, the silence of betrayal.
Then the sky intervened. Around noon, the heavens opened. A torrential monsoon downpour lashed the battlefield, turning the dust into a quagmire of mud. For 30 minutes, the rain fell in sheets so thick one could barely see a hand in front of their face. In this chaotic deluge, the difference between an amateur army and a professional corporation became clear. The British gunners, drilled in discipline, immediately threw tarpaulins over their gunpowder kegs and cannons. They kept their powder dry. The Nawab's forces, vast and unwieldy, were slow to react. Their gunpowder sat exposed to the rain, turning into a useless gray sludge. When the rain stopped, the silence returned. The Nawab's loyal general, Mir Madan, one of the few men not bought by British gold, assumed that the British guns were as wet and useless as his own. He saw an opportunity to wipe out the invaders with a cavalry charge. He ordered his men forward. They galloped across the muddy plain, swords drawn, screaming their battle cries. They were met not with silence, but with a thunderclap. The British guns, dry and deadly, opened fire with grape shot, canisters filled with musket balls that turned cannons into giant shotguns. The carnage was instant. Mir Madan was struck by a cannonball and died instantly. With his death, the spirit of the loyalist forces broke. Panic began to ripple through the Nawab's lines. Siraj-ud-Dawla, watching from his tent, turned to his commander-in-chief, Mir Jafar, and begged him to attack. He reportedly took off his turban, the ultimate symbol of his honor and sovereignty, and placed it at Mir Jafar's feet, pleading, "Defend it." Mir Jafar looked at the turban in the mud. He looked at the young Nawab. And then he gave the advice that sealed the fate of a nation. He told Siraj to pull back the troops and return the next day. It was a lie designed to expose the army to a rout. As Siraj ordered the retreat, Clive saw the confusion. He ordered a general advance. The British line, red coats stained with mud, surged forward. At that moment, Mir Jafar's division simply stepped aside. They opened the door to Bengal. They allowed the British to walk right through the defensive lines to slaughter the confused loyalists. Siraj-ud-Dawla realized too late that the knife was already in his back. He fled the battlefield on a fast camel, carrying a casket of jewels and his terrified wife. He left behind his army, his crown, and his honor. The Battle of Plassey was over by 5 p.m. It wasn't a battle, it was a riot. The British lost fewer than 25 men. The Nawab lost an empire. It was a victory achieved not by bravery, but by the ledger. The company had bought a kingdom for the price of a bribe.
In the days following Plassey, the true nature of the company's victory became clear. It was not a liberation, it was a liquidation. Siraj-ud-Dawla did not survive long. He was captured a few days later, hungry and disguised in rags, betrayed by a man whose ears he had once ordered cut off. He was dragged back to his capital, Murshidabad, and butchered in the dead of night by Mir Jafar's son. His body was paraded through the streets on the back of an elephant, a grim warning to anyone who dared defy the new order. Meanwhile, Robert Clive entered the treasury of Murshidabad. He later described walking through vaults piled high with gold, jewels, and silver on either hand. He walked through a literal tunnel of wealth. At that moment, he could have taken everything. He took a staggering sum, £234,000 for himself, worth tens of millions today, and £2.5 million for the company. When later questioned by the British Parliament about his greed, Clive famously replied, "By God, Mr. Chairman, at this moment I stand astonished at my own moderation." Mir Jafar was placed on the throne, a puppet Nawab in a gilded cage. But the strings were tight. The company demanded huge reparations for their losses. They demanded trade monopolies. They demanded the right to mint their own coins. The treasury of Bengal, once the envy of the world, was emptied into the hull of British ships. This was the beginning of the drain of wealth. Before Plassey, the British had to bring silver bullion from Europe to buy Indian goods. After Plassey, they stopped bringing money. They used the tax revenue of Bengal to buy the goods of Bengal and then sell them in Europe for pure profit. It was a perfect vampiric cycle. India was paying for its own colonization. The news of Plassey reached London like a shot of adrenaline. The company's stock price rocketed. The directors popped champagne corks. They didn't care about the moral cost of the betrayal. They cared that the dividends were safe. But back in the humid heat of Bengal, the ecosystem was collapsing. The puppet, Mir Jafar, soon realized he had sold his soul to a demon that could never be satisfied. When he couldn't pay the increasing demands, the company simply deposed him and sold the throne to his son-in-law, Mir Qasim. The throne of Bengal had become a tradable commodity, auctioned to the highest bidder. The weaver at his loom, the farmer in his rice paddy, didn't know the names of the men in the boardrooms in London. They didn't know about stock prices or dividends, but they felt the weight of the chains tightening. The soldiers who walked their streets now wore red coats, but they served a foreign master. The tax collectors no longer accepted excuses. The company had ceased to be a merchant. It had become a sovereign power, wielding the sword of the state to enforce the greed of the shareholder. And as the vaults of London filled with gold, the fields of Bengal were being sown with the seeds of the greatest tragedy the subcontinent would ever see. The hunger was coming.
The loot of Bengal, a famine made for profit. If Plassey was the crime, 1765 was the coronation of the criminal. Imagine a scene that defies all modern political logic. It is August 1765. The location is a silk tent pitched on the banks of the Ganges in Allahabad. Inside sits the Mughal Emperor, Shah Alam II. He is a man of high lineage but low fortune, defeated in battle and desperate to keep his title. Opposite him sits Robert Clive, now Lord Clive, the predator returned. The atmosphere is not one of a diplomatic summit, but of a foreclosure.
In a ceremony that took less time than a tea break, the emperor signed a firman, a royal decree. It granted the East India Company the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The Diwani was not just a title, it was the right to collect taxes. In that singular stroke of a pen, a private corporation based in a small office in London was given the legal right to tax 20 million people. It was as if Amazon or Google were suddenly granted the right to collect income tax from the entire population of France. The genius of this arrangement was its evil simplicity. Clive created a dual system of government. The puppet Nawab was left with the responsibility of administration, policing the streets, judging the courts, and maintaining order, but he had no money to do it. The company, on the other hand, held the purse strings. They collected the revenue, but had absolutely no responsibility for the welfare of the people. It was power without accountability, the dream of every tyrant and the nightmare of every citizen. The result was a plunder of biblical proportions. Before the British took over, the tax rate in Bengal had been traditionally set at a manageable 10% of the harvest. In bad years, the local rulers would often waive the tax entirely, opening the royal granaries to feed the poor. It was a social contract. The ruler took a share, but he kept the people alive. The company tore up this contract. They were not rulers, they were shareholders. They did not see subjects, they saw yield. Within a few years, they had raised the land tax to 50%. It didn't matter if the harvest was good or bad. It didn't matter if the rains came or failed. The ledger demanded its due. The company's agents, often ruthless local contractors who earned a commission on what they collected, descended on the villages like locusts. They flogged peasants who couldn't pay. They seized cattle, seeds, and tools. They stripped the land bare. Meanwhile, a new species of human began to appear in the drawing rooms of London, the nabob. These were company officials returning from India, dripping in diamonds and arrogance. They bought country estates, seats in parliament, and titles. They were the oligarchs of the 18th century, their wealth built on the broken backs of Bengali farmers. The British public looked at them with a mix of envy and disgust, whispering about the shaking of the pagoda tree. But no one stopped the shaking. In Bengal, the ecosystem was screaming. The weavers, once the envy of the world, were forced to work for the company at prices fixed so low they couldn't afford to buy food. Some, in a final act of defiance and despair, were rumored to have cut off their own thumbs so they could no longer be forced to weave for the British. The farmers, stripped of their surplus, had no reserves left for a rainy day, or more dangerously, for a dry one. They were living on the razor's edge of survival. The company had removed the safety net. They had turned a resilient society into a fragile one, vulnerable to the slightest shock. And then, in 1769, the shock came. The monsoon, the lifeblood of India, failed. The skies over Bengal remained a stubborn, cloudless blue. The rice paddies turned into cracked mosaics of dry mud. The crops withered on the stalk. In a normal functioning state, the government would have halted tax collection and distributed grain. But the East India Company did not function like a state. It functioned like a hedge fund. When the rains failed in 1769, the alarm bells should have rung in Calcutta. The peasants saw the signs first. The price of rice began to inch upward in the local markets. The rivers shrank into muddy trickles. The grain stores in the villages, usually kept full for the lean months, were already empty, swept clean by the company's tax collectors the previous season. But inside Fort William, the governor and his council were not looking at the sky. They were looking at their targets. They had promised the directors in London a record revenue that year. To admit a famine would be to admit a loss in profit. So they did the unthinkable. As the famine tightened its grip in early 1770, the company did not offer relief. Instead, they rigorously enforced the tax collection. In some districts, perverse as it sounds, they actually increased the tax rate by 10% to compensate for the losses from those who had already died. It was a logic so cold it defies human comprehension. The living were made to pay for the dead. The countryside of Bengal, once a lush green paradise, transformed into a landscape of hell. By the summer of 1770, the hunger had moved from the villages to the towns. John Shore, a company official, later wrote of the groans of the dying and the cries of the living, but words on a page cannot capture the visceral horror of what unfolded.
Eyewitnesses described skeletons walking the roads, men and women reduced to skin stretched tight over bone, their eyes hollow and mad with hunger. Desperation broke the most primal taboos of humanity. People ate leaves, grass, and the bark of trees. When that was gone, they ate the leather of their shoes. And in the darkest whispers of the time, horrific accounts emerged of mothers consuming their own dead children in a final, frantic bid to survive. The silence was the worst part. The bustling markets of Murshidabad and Dhaka fell quiet. The looms stopped clicking. The fields lay fallow. The only sound was the wind blowing through empty doorways and the flapping of wings. Vultures and jackals, the scavengers of the wild, grew fat. They became so emboldened that they would attack the dying before they were even dead. The Ganges River, considered holy by the Hindus, became a conveyor belt of corpses. The survivors were too weak to cremate their dead, and wood was too expensive to buy. So they simply threw the bodies into the river. Thousands of bloated, rotting forms floated past the windows of the British factories, a parade of the victims of corporate greed. And what of the company? While Bengal ate grass, the company's granaries were full. But this rice was not for the people, it was for the Sepoy Army and for export. In a supreme act of market manipulation, company officials and their Indian agents engaged in grain speculation. They bought up the remaining stocks of rice, hoarded it, and then sold it back to the starving population at inflated prices. They were profiteering on the apocalypse. One British officer noted with chilling detachment, "One could not pass the streets without seeing the dead and dying, but the revenue was collected with great regularity." That sentence encapsulates the soul of the East India Company. The revenue was collected with great regularity. The machinery of the corporation continued to grind on, indifferent to the biological reality of the humans who fueled it. By the time the monsoon finally returned at the end of 1770, the damage was done. The statistics were apocalyptic. It is estimated that 10 million people perished. 10 million! That was 1/3 of the entire population of Bengal. It was as if the entire population of modern London or New York simply ceased to exist in a matter of months. In London, the news was received not with horror, but with disappointment. The revenue collection had dipped slightly. Warren Hastings, a rising star in the company, who would later become the first Governor-General, wrote a report to the board of directors. In it, he did not dwell on the tragedy of the lost lives. Instead, he boasted that despite the massive loss of population, the net revenue collected had actually increased over the previous year. He wrote it as a success story. He had squeezed a stone and found blood. The aftermath of the Great Famine of 1770 changed the landscape of Bengal forever. Travelers who journeyed through the province in the years that followed described a haunted world. Vast tracts of fertile farmland, once the breadbasket of Asia, had been reclaimed by the jungle. Tigers and elephants roamed where villages had once stood. It was a silence bought by gold. But in a twist of supreme irony, the famine that destroyed Bengal also nearly destroyed the company itself. You cannot tax a corpse. With a third of the workforce dead, the economy cratered. The weavers were gone, the farmers were gone. The golden goose had been starved to death. Simultaneously, the company was bleeding money on military campaigns and the personal corruption of its own officers. The nabobs were returning to England with fortunes, but the company's official accounts were in the red. By 1772, the East India Company, the ruler of millions and the conqueror of the subcontinent, faced a humiliation that would sound familiar to modern ears. It was too big to fail, yet it was bankrupt. Desperate, the directors went to the British Parliament hat in hand, begging for a bailout. They asked for a loan of £1.4 million to save them from insolvency. The reaction in London was explosive. The British public had watched the nabobs buying up castles while the company pleaded poverty. Horace Walpole, a prominent politician, wrote with venom, "What is England now? A sink of Indian wealth." The mask of the humble merchant was ripped away completely. Everyone could now see the company for what it was, a rapacious, ungovernable monster that had committed a genocide for a dividend that didn't even arrive. This crisis led to the Regulating Act of 1773. It was the first time the British government tried to put a leash on the beast. They installed a Governor-General, Warren Hastings, to bring order to the chaos. Hastings was a complex man, a scholar of Persian, an admirer of Indian culture, yet a ruthless administrator who believed in the absolute right of British rule. The bailout also had a ripple effect that would change the world in a way no one expected. To help the company pay off its debts, Parliament passed the Tea Act, allowing the company to dump its surplus tea rotting in London warehouses onto the American colonies. This monopoly on tea infuriated a group of colonists in Boston. They boarded the company ships and threw the crates into the harbor. The spark that lit the American Revolution was struck in the bankruptcy caused by the looting of Bengal. The starving Bengal peasant and the American patriot were connected by the same invisible chain of corporate greed.
Back in India, Warren Hastings looked out from the ramparts of Fort William. He saw a broken land, a decimated population, and a treasury that needed refilling. He knew that the era of simple looting was over. To survive, the company had to evolve again. It could not just be a tax collector. It had to be a military superpower. It had to conquer not just Bengal, but the threats rising in the south and the west, the tigers of Mysore and the horsemen of the Marathas. The famine had proved that the company could kill millions with a pen. Now they would have to prove they could control the survivors with a gun. The accountant was stepping back. The general was stepping forward. The conquest was about to go total. The army of mercenaries, conquering India with Indian blood. History poses a mathematical riddle that seems impossible to solve. By the early 19th century, the British population in India, including soldiers, traders, and officials, numbered perhaps 40,000. The Indian population was nearly 200 million. How does a group the size of a small English town conquer a civilization the size of a continent? The answer is uncomfortable. The British did not conquer India. India conquered India. The East India Company realized early on that importing soldiers from England was a logistical nightmare. It took 6 months to sail from London to Bombay. The mortality rate on the voyage was high. The cost was astronomical. And when British soldiers arrived, the tropical heat, malaria, and cholera killed them faster than any enemy sword. So the company turned to the most abundant resource available, the Indian peasant. They created the sepoy, a corruption of the Persian word sipahi, meaning soldier. But the company did something revolutionary. They didn't just hire mercenaries, they built a machine.
They recruited primarily from the high-caste Brahmins and Rajputs of the Gangetic Plains, men who carried a deep cultural sense of honor and hierarchy. The company offered them something Indian princes rarely could: regularity. In the chaotic feudal armies of the time, pay was often months late, dependent on the plunder of the next battle. The company paid on the first of every month, in silver. They offered a pension after 20 years of service. They offered new red uniforms, shiny muskets, and the status of serving a powerful master. In exchange, the sepoy gave his salt, his namak. In Indian culture, eating the salt of a master creates a sacred bond of loyalty that transcends religion or nationality. The British understood this. They manipulated this cultural code perfectly. They didn't ask the sepoy to fight for King George III or the board of directors. They asked him to fight for the honor of his regiment. They created a new tribe, defined not by blood, but by the uniform. Walk through a company training camp in 1800 and you would see a sight that terrified traditional Indian observers. Thousands of men moving as a single organism. Load, prime, ram, present, fire. The mesmerizing rhythm of the musket drill. In traditional Indian warfare, battles were often decided by individual acts of heroism, the bravery of a cavalry charge, or the duel of elephants. The British brought the Industrial Revolution to the battlefield. They treated war not as an art, but as a factory process. A wall of redcoats firing 4 rounds a minute was not a collection of warriors, it was a grinder. But as the company expanded its grip, it encountered enemies that could not be easily bullied. The Mughals were gone, but new powers had risen from the ashes. In the south, nestled in the high plateau of the Deccan, lay the kingdom of Mysore, and ruling it was a man the British could not bribe, intimidate, or ignore. Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore. Tipu was the British nightmare incarnate. He was not a decadent relic of the past, he was a modernist. He wore clothes made from homespun cotton to support his own economy. He imported French engineers to build modern forts. He had a library of 2,000 books. And most terrifyingly, he had technology that the British did not: rockets. Long before the Congreve rockets of Europe, Tipu's army had developed iron-cased rockets, missiles packed with gunpowder and attached to long bamboo poles. When fired in mass, they screamed through the air like banshees, reaching distances of 2 kilometers, crashing into the British lines and exploding with devastating force. For 4 brutal wars, the company threw its sepoy legions against the walls of Seringapatam, Tipu's capital. It was a clash of civilizations. On one side, the ruthless corporate machine backed by the salt of its mercenaries. On the other, a warrior king fighting for the sovereignty of his land, his banner emblazoned with the stripes of a tiger. The climax came in 1799. The British, led by Lord Wellesley, brother of the future Duke of Wellington, surrounded Seringapatam. They had bought off Tipu's key ministers, the old company tactic of the golden key opening the gate. When the walls were breached, Tipu did not flee. He was found later that evening under a pile of corpses, sword in hand, shot through the temple. With the tiger dead, the company looted Seringapatam with a ferocity that shocked even their own officers. They stripped the gold from the throne, the jewels from the treasury, and even the clothes from the corpse of the king. But the fall of Mysore was just the beginning. The company now turned its hungry gaze north to the vast confederacy of the Marathas. These were the horse lords who had shattered the Mughal Empire. They were a loose alliance of powerful warlords, Scindia, Holkar, Bhonsle, who controlled central India. The company knew they couldn't fight the Marathas all at once, so they used the weapon they had perfected in Bengal: divide and rule.
The destruction of the Maratha Confederacy was a masterclass in the company's most potent strategy, the subsidiary alliance. It worked like a protection racket on a continental scale. A company envoy would arrive at the court of a Maratha chief, say the Peshwa in Pune or the Scindia in Gwalior, with a polite but loaded offer. Your neighbors are planning to attack you. We can rent you a regiment of our disciplined sepoys to protect you. You just have to pay for their upkeep and dismiss all your French advisors. If the ruler agreed, he allowed a Trojan horse into his capital. The company troops would set up camp right outside his palace. Slowly, the bill for their protection would rise. When the ruler couldn't pay, the company would seize a slice of his territory as collateral. Piece by piece, the kingdom was mortgaged until the ruler was nothing but a pensioner in his own land. If the ruler refused, then the protection turned into invasion. In 1803, the Second Anglo-Maratha War erupted. It was a collision of titans. The Marathas were not a tribal rabble. They had French-trained infantry and the most feared light cavalry in Asia. But they were fighting a hydra. The company could attack from Bombay, Madras, and Bengal simultaneously. The defining moment came at the Battle of Plassey in September 1803. Arthur Wellington, the future Duke of Wellington, who would later defeat Napoleon at Waterloo, led the company forces. He later recalled Plassey as the hardest contested battle of his life, bloodier than Waterloo itself. The British and Sepoy lines faced a massive Maratha army of 50,000 men and 100 cannons. The air was so thick with cannon smoke that the sun was blotted out. For hours the Sepoys stood shoulder to shoulder, their ranks torn apart by grape shot, closing the gaps over the bodies of their brothers, never breaking formation. They marched into the mouths of the guns. When the dust settled, the Maratha power was broken. The dream of a Hindu empire replacing the Mughals lay dead on the fields of Plassey. By 1818, the map of India had undergone a transformation that defied belief. In 1757, the company was a squatter in Calcutta. 60 years later, it was the paramount power of the subcontinent. The pink map, the color of the British Empire, spread like an ink spill from the Himalayas to Cape Comorin. But as the empire grew, the soul of the company began to rot from the inside. In the early days of the 18th century, the company officers had been the white Mughals. Men like William Dalrymple have documented how these early traders fully immersed themselves in India. They wore pajamas and turbans. They spoke fluent Persian and Urdu. They smoked hookahs. Most importantly, they married Indian women and recognized their mixed-race children. There was a genuine, albeit complicated, cultural exchange. The sepoy looked at his white officer and saw a man who understood his customs, respected his caste, and perhaps even shared his blood. But as the Victorian era approached, a deep frost settled over the Raj. The steamship reduced the journey from England to India from 6 months to a few weeks. This allowed a new arrival, the British woman. The Memsahibs came to India with Victorian morals and a deep suspicion of the native. The racial lines hardened. The white officers stopped wearing Indian clothes. They moved out of the crowded, vibrant cities and into cantonments, segregated, sterile military zones with wide avenues and bungalows, strictly off-limits to Indians unless they were servants. They stopped learning the languages. They stopped marrying Indian women. The sepoy was no longer a comrade in arms. He became a coolie, a native, a racial inferior to be managed, not led. The bond of salt began to fray. The officers mocked the sepoys' religious rituals. They sneered at their caste dietary restrictions. Evangelical missionaries began to arrive, preaching that the Hindu gods were demons and that the sepoys needed to be saved by Christ. A dangerous paranoia began to brew in the barracks. The sepoys whispered that the company was not just here to take their land, it was here to take their dharma, their religion. They had conquered India for the British, and in return, the British were treating them with contempt.
The machine was huge, over 250,000 soldiers, the largest standing army in Asia. But a machine runs on oil, and this machine was running on friction. The company directors in London, obsessed with dividends, cut the sepoys extra pay for serving abroad. They introduced new regulations that forced high caste Hindus to travel overseas, which meant losing their caste status. The directors looked at the balance sheet and saw efficiency. They didn't look at the faces of the men holding the muskets. They didn't see the tightening jaws, the averted eyes, the secret meetings in the night. They were sitting on a powder keg, and they were busy counting coins. All it would take was a single spark, a rumor, a lie, or perhaps the grease of a cartridge to blow the whole empire into the sky. If the racial divide was the kindling, Lord Dalhousie was the man who poured gasoline on the pile. Arriving as Governor-General in 1848, Dalhousie was an aristocrat who viewed India not as a civilization to be respected, but as a chaotic mess to be tidied up. He was a man of the Industrial Revolution, cold, efficient, and ruthlessly modern. He introduced a legal weapon more potent than any cannon, the doctrine of lapse.
The law was simple and devastating. If an Indian ruler died without a biological male heir, his adopted children, recognized by Hindu custom for millennia, would be ignored. The kingdom would lapse, be annexed, directly into the company's portfolio. With a stroke of a pen, Dalhousie erased the sovereignty of Satara, Sambalpur, and Jhansi. The Rani of Jhansi, Lakshmi Bai, famously cried out, "I will not give up my Jhansi." But the company's lawyers were deaf to the cries of queens. But Dalhousie's greatest overreach came in 1856 with the annexation of Oudh, or Awadh. Oudh was not an enemy state, it was the company's oldest ally. It was the heartland of the Sepoy Army. Nearly 75,000 soldiers in the company's ranks hailed from its villages. They sent their paychecks home to Oudh to support their families. When Dalhousie marched his troops into Lucknow and deposed the beloved eccentric King Wajid Ali Shah on vague charges of mismanagement, he didn't just topple a king, he broke the hearts of his own army. The sepoys watched in horror as the king they revered was exiled to Calcutta. They watched as the company's land surveyors moved into their villages, dismantling the old feudal structures, taxing the families of the very soldiers who were conquering India for them. A sepoy in the Bengal Army later wrote, "I felt that I was fighting for the men who were stealing my mother's jewelry." Simultaneously, a terrifying new magic began to crisscross the landscape. The British erected long lines of wooden poles connected by copper wires, the electric telegraph. To the villagers, this was sorcery, the lightning post that allowed the sahibs to speak across hundreds of miles instantly. Then came the iron horse, the railway. Massive steam engines tore through the countryside, cutting across sacred pilgrimage routes, demanding that Brahmins and untouchables sit together in the same metal box. The rumors flew through the bazaars like wildfire. They are trying to destroy our caste. They are trying to turn us all into Christians. They are chaining the land with iron. The atmosphere in early 1857 was heavy, like the static air before a monsoon storm. The company was at the height of its power. It controlled the entire subcontinent. Its revenues were immense. Its officers were confident, sipping gin and tonics on their verandas, believing they were beloved by the people they ruled. They were blind. And then the company introduced the pattern 1853 Enfield rifle. It was a state-of-the-art weapon, more accurate and deadly than the old smoothbore muskets. But to load it, a soldier had to bite off the end of a paper cartridge, pour the gunpowder down the barrel, and ram the bullet home. The paper cartridge was heavily greased to make it slide down the barrel. A whisper began in the breathless heat of the Dum-Dum arsenal near Calcutta. A low-caste laborer taunted a high-caste sepoy who refused him a drink of water. "You think you are pure?" the laborer laughed. "Wait until you have to bite the new cartridges. They are greased with the fat of cows and pigs." The cow is sacred to Hindus. The pig is unclean to Muslims. If the rumor was true, the company was forcing every soldier, Hindu and Muslim alike, to commit a religious abomination every time they loaded their weapon. It was not just a physical violation, it was a spiritual execution. The company denied it. They claimed it was sheep fat or beeswax, but the denial only fueled the paranoia. It was seen as the final proof of the great conspiracy to destroy their religions. The salt was gone. The loyalty was broken. The machine that had conquered a continent was now pointing its rifle back at its creator. In March 1857, at the Barrackpore cantonment, a young Brahmin sepoy, high on bhang and religious fervor, stepped out onto the parade ground. His name was Mangal Pandey. He loaded his musket, perhaps with the very cartridge he despised, and shouted to his brothers, "Come out, the Europeans are here. Why are you waiting? From biting these cartridges we shall become infidels." He fired the first shot. It missed its target, but it hit history. The Fall of the Leviathan, 1857, and the end of the company. Sunday, May 10th, 1857, Meerut. The sun was setting, casting long blood-red shadows over the British cantonment. It was a stiflingly hot evening. The British officers and their families were preparing for church service, dressed in their Sunday best, bonnets and tailcoats, a surreal pocket of Victorian England transplanted into the dust of Uttar Pradesh. They felt safe. They felt masterful. They had no idea that the world was about to end. In the native lines, the simmering rage had boiled over. 85 sepoys had been court-martialed and shackled in irons the previous day for refusing to touch the new cartridges. They had been stripped of their uniforms and humiliated in front of their comrades. As the British bells rang for evening prayer, a different sound erupted from the bazaars, the roar of a mob. The cry went up, "Maro Firangi, kill the foreigner." The jail doors were smashed open, the shackles were struck off, the sepoys, now mutineers, grabbed their weapons. What followed was a night of fire and screaming. Bungalows were torched, officers were cut down on their verandas. The illusion of control vanished in an hour.
But the mutineers did not stay in Meerut to celebrate. They did something instinctive, something that revealed the deep, subconscious longing of the Indian people. They marched. They didn't march home to their villages. They marched 40 miles south, through the cool night, towards the only symbol of authority they recognized. Delhi, the Red Fort, the home of the Mughal Emperor. Bahadur Shah Zafar was 82 years old. He was a poet, a mystic, a fragile old man who spent his days writing Urdu couplets and watching doves fly over the Yamuna River. He was a pensioner of the East India Company, a king in name only, wielding no power beyond the walls of his palace. On the morning of May 11th, he woke to a clamor beneath his balcony. He looked down to see thousands of dust-covered soldiers, their bayonets glinting in the morning sun. They looked up at him not as a pensioner, but as the Badshah, the emperor of Hindustan. They demanded he lead them. They demanded he bless their holy war against the company. Zafar hesitated. He knew the power of the British. He knew this was suicide, but he had no choice. The soldiers forced their way into the palace, killing the British resident and the European Christians sheltering inside. With trembling hands, the old poet accepted the allegiance of the soldiers. The Mughal Empire, dead for a century, was resurrected for one final violent summer. The uprising spread like a contagion along the Grand Trunk Road. Lucknow,
Kanpur, Jhansi, Gwalior. The telegraph wires were cut, leaving the British isolated in tiny islands of fear. The company was losing India. The violence was primal. In Kanpur, the rebel leader Nana Sahib besieged the British garrison. After weeks of starvation and shelling, the British surrendered under a promise of safe passage. But as they boarded the boats at the Satichachara Ghat, chaos erupted. The boats were torched, the men were massacred in the water. The surviving women and children were herded into a small house known as the Bibigar. What happened there became the dark emotional core of the British psyche for the next century. Under orders from frantic rebel leaders, butchers were sent into the house with cleavers. When the British relief force arrived days later, they found the floor awash in blood and the well outside filled with the bodies of women and children. The Bibigar massacre changed the nature of the war. For the British, this was no longer a military campaign to restore order. It was a crusade of vengeance. The rules of war were abandoned. The devil's wind began to blow. If the mutiny was a release of century-old rage, the British retribution was a cold, industrial slaughter. They called it the devil's wind. Reinforcements poured in from the corners of the empire, Highlanders from Scotland, Sikhs from the Punjab who hated the Mughals and stayed loyal to the British, and naval brigades with heavy guns. The British commanders, men like General Neil and General Havelock, were no longer interested in winning hearts and minds. They were interested in extermination. As the British columns marched up the Grand Trunk Road to retake the lost cities, they left a trail of horror behind them. General Neil gave orders that were simple and absolute: guilty until proven innocent. Along the road for hundreds of miles, the mango trees that had once provided shade for travelers were converted to gallows. Observers described rows of bodies swaying in the wind. Villagers, soldiers, anyone suspected of sympathy with the rebels. It was psychological warfare designed to terrorize the population into submission. But the most gruesome theater of vengeance was the practice of blowing from guns. It was a method of execution chosen specifically for its spiritual horror. A prisoner was marched out to a parade ground. He was tied to the muzzle of a cannon, the cold iron pressing against the small of his back. On the command, the gunner lit the fuse. The explosion didn't just kill the man, it obliterated him. The body was blown to atoms, scattering pieces over the gathered crowd. For a Victorian British officer, this was a messy execution. For the Hindu or Muslim victim, it was catastrophic. It meant there was no body to bury or cremate, no funeral rites, no passage to the afterlife. It was a sentence of eternal damnation. The uprising culminated where it began, at the gates of Delhi. By September 1857, the British had besieged the city. They held the ridge overlooking the Red Fort, but they were outnumbered and dying of cholera. It was a stalemate of desperation. Finally, they decided to gamble everything on one assault. They blew the Kashmiri Gate and poured into the city. The street fighting was savage. Delhi, the jewel of the Mughals, the city of poetry and light, was turned into a charnel house. The British soldiers, drunk on looted liquor and blinded by the stories of Kanpur, spared no one. Civilians were bayoneted in their homes. The great libraries were burned. The mosques were turned into bakeries or stables. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last emperor, fled from the Red Fort. He took refuge in the tomb of his ancestor, Humayun, a magnificent garden tomb on the outskirts of the city. It was there, amidst the marble and sandstone of his dynasty's past, that the future caught up with him. Major William Hudson, a rogue British intelligence officer known for his brutality, rode out to the tomb. He found the old emperor waiting in the shadows, surrounded by his terrified family. Zafar surrendered his sword, a curved blade that had once symbolized the dominion of Islam over India. Hudson took it, promising the emperor his life.
But he made no such promise to the emperor's sons. The next day, Hudson arrested 2 of the emperor's sons and his grandson. He put them on a bullock cart to take them back to Delhi. Halfway there, surrounded by a jeering crowd, Hudson stopped the cart. He ordered the princes to strip naked. Then, in cold blood, he took out his revolver and shot them dead at point-blank range. He cut off their heads and reportedly presented them to the emperor on a platter. With those 3 gunshots, the Mughal dynasty, which had ruled India for 3 centuries, was extinguished. The line of Akbar and Aurangzeb ended in the dust of a roadside ditch. The rebellion was broken. The Rani of Jhansi died fighting on horseback, a warrior to the end. Nana Sahib vanished into the jungles of Nepal, never to be seen again. Tantia Tope was betrayed and hanged. The fire that had threatened to consume the British Empire burned out, leaving behind a scarred, silent land. The East India Company had won the war, but in doing so, they had exposed their own incompetence so thoroughly that their own death warrant had been signed in London. In London, the mood was not one of victory, but of horror. The accounts of the mutiny, the massacres at the reprisals, the near loss of the jewel in the crown shocked the British public. But more importantly, it shocked the establishment. The British government realized that a private corporation, answerable only to its shareholders, could no longer be trusted with the lives of 200 million people. The merchants' gamble had finally failed. The East India Company, the most powerful economic organism the world had ever seen, was put on trial. Its defense that it had generated profit was no longer enough to justify the chaos it had unleashed. On August 2, 1858, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act. It was a death sentence for the company. The scene of the execution was not a battlefield, but a ceremony in Allahabad on November 1, 1858. Lord Canning, the Governor-General, stood on a raised platform before a massive gathering of princes and soldiers. He read out a proclamation from Queen Victoria. "We have resolved, for diverse and weighty reasons, to take upon ourselves the government of the territories in India heretofore administered in trust for us by the Honourable East India Company." With those dry, legalistic words, the company was stripped of its armies, its forts, its territories, and its revenues. The flag of the East India Company, the striped banner that had inspired the American flag, was lowered from the ramparts of Fort William and the Red Fort. In its place rose the Union Jack. The era of the Company Raj was over. The era of the British Raj had begun. For the Indian peasant, the change was subtle but profound. The white men in charge were no longer agents of a business, they were civil servants of a queen. The naked rapacity of the 18th century was replaced by the cold, bureaucratic paternalism of the 19th. The queen promised religious tolerance and respect for ancient customs, a direct apology for the grease on the cartridges. But the chains remained. They were just painted gold. And what of the company itself? The Leviathan did not die immediately. It lingered on as a zombie entity in a small office in London, managing the payout of dividends to its shareholders. Finally, in 1874, the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act was passed. The company was formally dissolved. Its ledgers were archived, its furniture was sold. The corporation that had conquered the Mughals, defeated the Dutch and French, starved Bengal, and reshaped the global economy simply ceased to exist. Walk down Leadenhall Street in London today, and you will find no great statue to the East India Company. There is no museum dedicated to its conquest. There is only a small blue plaque, easily missed by the rushing commuters, marking the spot where the headquarters once stood. It seems almost impossible that this small patch of concrete was once the cockpit of the world. From here, orders were sent to the toppled kings. From here, the price of tea in Boston and the price of opium in Canton were decided. From here, a private board of directors ruled over more people than the emperors of Rome. History likes to remember empires as nations, Rome, Mongolia, Spain, Britain, but the story of the East India Company is a warning from the past to the future.
It was the first true multinational corporation. It invented the lobbyist. It invented the corporate bailout. It proved that when profit is decoupled from morality, a business can become a monster. We live in a world today that the company helped build, a world of global supply chains, shareholder value, and corporate power that rivals the state. When we look at the tech giants and data monopolies of the 21st century, we are looking at the spiritual descendants of the honorable company. The East India Company is dead. Its ships have rotted, its forts are museums, its ledgers are dust. But the question it posed remains unanswered. What happens when a merchant becomes a monarch? The answer is written in the graveyards of Bengal and the ruins of the Red Fort. The answer is that the ledger has no soul and the market has no memory.